Today's video is brought to you by Squarespace. Stay tuned until the end for a special offer. Hello dear friends, today's video is going to be a tutorial on how to paint fabric with oils. I haven't painted fabric that much before, but after doing this fabric study from life at my atelier, I thought I might as well share some tips I learned from class. But my disclaimer, as usual, is please take what I say with a grain of salt because my own techniques are just based on my personal experiences and preferences. And as always, I encourage you to experiment with different techniques to find one that works best for you. Real quick before I start, if you'd like to see a 30-minute version of this tutorial with instructional voiceover, along with hundreds of hours of exclusive content and monthly art rewards, feel free to check out my Patreon at patreon.com/happydartist. For materials, I'm using a 9 by 12 inch sheet of Arches oil paper plus palette paper, both taped to a drawing board with masking tape. As always, my supplies are listed in the video description. I painted this in about 2.5 hours from a really cool statue that lives in our studio, and I just draped some of our classroom fabrics over her to create some cool wrinkles and movement. There is one main light source using a standard cool white light bulb shining from directly overhead, and a secondary warm orange light source shining from the lower right. As with painting any subject, it's important to always be aware of the direction, color, and intensity of the light source. An accurate handling of the highlights and shadows on the fabric wrinkles will help it look more realistic. And the way the color of the light interacts with the color of the subject has to make sense. So when the blue cloth on the lower body mixes with the warm orange light, they end up creating more orange heavy colors closer to the orange light source and more bluish hues further away from the orange light source. And they will both create an intermediary type of gray in the areas in between. So when you mixed two complementary colors like orange and blue together, you usually end up neutralizing both colors into a grayish zone. The next thing to consider is abstraction. In class, we learned that no matter what we are painting, we first need to learn how to observe the subject we're looking at through the lens of abstraction. And abstraction in this case means being able to shed your initial impressions of what this subject should look like and instead break down the subject into a series of abstract shapes and then replicate those shapes as faithfully as you can onto your painting. A great example of the importance of abstraction is when we paint eyes. Typically, we think of the human eye as this kind of football almond shape, but if you render eyes on a human that are shaped like perfect footballs, it comes off looking very unrealistic. So instead of thinking an eye is supposed to look like a football, we must pretend that we've never seen a human eye before and try to just mimic the organic, precise shape of the eye as if we were trying to paint an abstract shape that isn't supposed to resemble anything at all. So with cloth, I had to stop thinking about how things are supposed to look and just create these abstract shapes as accurately as I can. But what are we supposed to fill these shapes with? The answer is our next tip: values. I'm sure you all know this by now, but just in case, the value of an element just means how light or dark it is. So once we have mapped out the correct shapes, we need to fill those shapes with the correct values. Just because cloth is blue doesn't mean it's all one consistent shade of blue. We have lighter blues in the peaks that are catching the highlights and darker blues in areas that are submerged in shadow. We also have the secondary warm light source causing some of the lower right areas to be lighter to darker shades of orange. With values, we also need to pay attention to the fall of light, meaning that the areas further away from the light source will be universally darker in value than the areas closer to the light source. So for example, the brightest highlight on an area that's close to the light source might be close to pure white, but the brightest highlight on an area that's further away from the light source might be more of a medium gray. The shadows, of course, also have to follow the same fall of light hierarchy. So the shadows in an area closer to the light source might end up being the same value as the highlight on an area further away from the light source. I hope that makes sense. I guess the general rule of thumb is no matter if it's a highlight, midtone, or shadow, all the values closer to the light source will generally be lighter than all their corresponding values that are further away from the light source. So just be careful to not render all of your highlights using the same intense bright colors and all your shadows using the same intense dark colors. We want to always factor in the distance between the section that you're painting in relation to the light source. And lastly, we need to pay attention to the length, direction, and softness of our brush strokes. Vast expanses of flat areas or the larger, rounder wrinkles will need soft, larger, more varied brush strokes. And areas with tight, smaller wrinkles obviously will need sharper, thinner brush strokes. And we have to keep in mind that cloth is basically millions of threads woven into a grid-like pattern. So even if you have long, thin wrinkles, we shouldn't just paint long, thin lines. Instead, we should incorporate some shorter perpendicular brush strokes to help break up those long, thin lines, to help prevent the fabric from looking like noodles, and to help preserve the impression of a single unified sheet of cloth. Honestly, all these tips that I talked about today can be applied to any subject, not just fabric. Things like paying attention to your values, the softness of your edges, the light source, the fall of light. These are all applicable universal tips, no matter what subject you're trying to tackle. And that about wraps up today's tutorial. I hope I made sense and that my explanations weren't too confusing, but if I did confuse you at all, which would be totally understandable, always feel free to ask me any clarification questions in the comments below. Thank you as always for listening to me ramble on and for all of your support. If you're interested in adopting this oil study, it's now available in my shop at happyd-artist.com. And if you want the piece at a huge discount, my never-ending sale is still going on in my shop. So if you want 20% off your order of prints and originals, just enter the code HOLIDAY at happyd-artist.com. And if you're interested in learning more about how to paint and draw, I have lots of art educational content on my Patreon page, including exclusive video tutorials, step-by-step photo tutorials, live streams, podcasts, and even surprise art gift boxes. All available at patreon.com/happydartist. I'd love to have you join my Patreon family. I wanted to quickly thank Squarespace for sponsoring this video and for supporting my channel and the art community. I've actually enjoyed using Squarespace for 4 years now to build and host my online shop and website. So whether you need a domain, website, or online store, make your next move with Squarespace. Start your free trial today at squarespace.com and visit squarespace.com/happydartist for 10% off your first purchase. Also, if you want to check out more artworks, works in progress, and just random daily artist adventures, feel free to check out my Instagram and you can follow me at the handle @happydartist.